Right guys, MTech Guy here, and as it's a nice morning I thought we'd come outside and take a look at the E60 M5 and have a chat about the SMG Gearbox. Now I've done a few previous videos on the SMG, you know, how to drive one, what goes in to make the gearbox up, what I like about the SMG, but in today's video we're going to take a look at some of the common failure points and what to look out for when things start going wrong. Now I wouldn't say the SMG was an unreliable gearbox, but due to the amount of components that make it up and how complex it is, there's certainly much greater potential for things to start going wrong in comparison to a traditional manual transmission. Now if you do start having issues with your SMG, it can be quite difficult to diagnose due to the amount of components that make the gearbox up. Now you certainly want to start by reading the codes. That should point you in the right direction to start off with. And when you approach the fault finding, it is definitely worth breaking it down into its different components. So ultimately, underneath it all, it is just a gearbox with an input shaft and output shaft. You've got a traditional single clutch, and then of course you've got a hydraulic pump and motor operating that clutch, so no clutch pedal. And then you've got the same for the gear change also, so you've got the hydraulic fluid, you've got a set of shift solenoids that are completing the job that you'd normally do by hand when selecting the gear. Now, the operation of the clutch and the gear changes are all carried out via the computer, and it's taking inputs from you, the driver, and also sensors throughout the car. So anyhow, what I'll do now is I'll run through some of the common faults and what to look out for. Alright, so like any regular manual gearbox, you're going to experience some clutch wear. It's probably accelerated just a tiny bit more with an SMG gearbox, just because you don't have that driver input so much, the computer's looking after a lot of it. So depending on what settings you have the gearbox set up in and the amount of slip that the computer's given the clutch, it's likely that it's going to wear out just slightly quicker than a regular manual transmission's clutch. Now sticking with the clutch area of the gearbox, next we'll move on to the clutch release bearing. Now the original design, the original clutch release bearings that were fitted to these cars would get issues with them getting chewed up and getting noisy. They get all worn and nailed up. Now they did bring out an updated design later on which is Teflon lined, so that's the one to go for. I think that's all that's available nowadays, but if you do fit one of them you don't have to grease or oil them like the previous ones, because obviously that Teflon lining will look after things, so it shouldn't be a problem at this stage in the car's life if it's had a replacement clutch release bearing fitted. So just something to keep in mind that's worth replacing if you do fit a new clutch. Now then, one of the inputs that the SMG's computer receives is the clutch position, and this is sent through the clutch position sensor. It's often referred to as the PLDC sensor. Now if this starts to fail, it can often give you error codes like 4FA0, 510E, 510D, so that's something to look out for and keep in mind if you are starting to get them codes and you're getting issues with your clutch position. Alright, so next up we'll talk about what actually moves your clutch in and out, and that's your slave cylinder. Now, the slave cylinder in the SMG III gearbox is partially positioned inside the bell housing itself, and what can happen over time is the slave cylinder seals can begin to leak. And yes, you guessed it, that means that you're going to end up with brake fluid inside your bell housing, and then of course a contaminated clutch. So not only will you have to replace the slave cylinder itself, which has failed, which the seals have failed, but you're also going to have to chuck a brand new clutch in as well. Yep, fantastic. So if you do get to the stage where you are doing a clutch job in one of these gearboxes and you haven't got any evidence of the slave cylinder being changed out, for the cost of what a slave cylinder is, it is worth chucking a brand new one in there. Then you ain't got to worry about ruining a brand new clutch if them seals do start leaking, so worth keeping in mind. Now these gearboxes have a dual mass flywheel, and you can experience issues where they begin to separate over time, but this is rare. It's not that common, but it has been known to happen. And then moving on to the gearbox itself, just like any regular manual gearbox, the synchros can break, and it's especially true in one of these cars because you can set the gearbox up where the shifts are absolutely brutal, but it is rare that this will present an issue. But if you find yourself in a position where you can't select a specific gear, this could be the issue. Now then, positioned on top of the gearbox, you have a block there with all your shift solenoids, and these can fail. But if they do fail, it's more than likely it's the sealing O-rings that fail. They go hard over time from the heat that they experience. Now if you are experiencing fluid pressure issues, leaky solenoids could be the contributing factor. And it's possibly just the O-rings need replacing. And then running on from this, any leak in the hydraulic system is going to present a hydraulic fluid pressure issue, which in turn is going to affect the overall performance of the SMG operation. Now, the hydraulic pump can fail, although people always refer to the SMG pump failing. It's more specifically the motor that drives the pump that normally is the issue. But of course, like any pump, the pump itself can wear out or the seals can become compromised, but this isn't that common. Normally, pump-related issues, it's the electric motor that drives the pump which is the failure point. Now, on the earlier M5s, they did have issues with the carbon dust from the brushes clogging up the inside of the motors and causing them to fail prematurely. Now, some owners chose to carry out maintenance on these motors by pulling them out, stripping them down, blowing all the dust out, giving them a good clean out, putting them back in the car. But it's not so necessary with the later design, and there was a recall done on the early cars to get these motors changed out because they had such a high failure rate. Now, another component that can cause hydraulic fluid pressure issues is the accumulator. This is nitrogen filled and it can slowly fail over time, losing its nitrogen pressure. If you find that the pump is having to frequently run on and off, especially when it's in neutral, a failing accumulator could be the contributing issue. Now, another failure point is the wiring harness to the shift solenoid unit. Now, this is more common than you'd like to think, and it's normally due to the amount of heat that it's exposed to down there in the transmission tunnel, and also the wiring insulation that BMW were using at the time is more susceptible to failing than, say, what you'd normally insulate wires with traditionally. Now, if you're lucky and you catch it in time, sometimes the wiring can be repaired, but often it'll mean that you've got to replace the whole harness, and it's all part of that shift solenoid unit, so you might be looking to replace the whole lot, unfortunately. But like I say, if you get lucky, you might get away with repairing it. Now then, believe it or not, a faulty bonnet hood switch, which is positioned over here, can also cause the SMG not to operate because it's part of the safety interlock system, and what will happen is you'll go to shift into gear and just nothing will happen. So it's worth checking that out if you are experiencing that issue. The SMG ECU itself can fail, and then the pressure sensors and temperature sensors that give in the inputs to the ECU can also fail. And then you've got other computer logic issues to think about, like making sure the clutch teaching procedure is done and done successfully after you've replaced the clutch. And if you've replaced the tyres on the car, make sure you've reinitialised the SMG. Alright guys, so there we have it. There's some of the common failure points on the SMG gearbox, what to keep in mind and what to look out for if you are experiencing issues with your SMG III gearbox. If you found the video interesting, don't forget to give it a like and make sure you subscribe and keep an eye out for more M5 content. I'm MTech Guy. Thanks a lot for watching.